Today I'm going to show you step by step how I paint this Colorado landscape scene. We're going to touch on watercolor timing and values and all the essentials to paint a dynamic scene in watercolor. One thing that drew me to this scene was this incredible sky, but also the light hitting the middle of this field and overall the atmosphere of this incredible scene. I lay out my drawing and I'm going to wet down the back and the front of my paper with a damp sponge. Now there's a lot of information in the sky, so that's what I'm going to start with first. I'm going to add some warm tone for the clouds. Now it's tempting to feel like we need to leave the clouds the white of the paper, but I like adding a little bit of warmth to them, and plus I enjoy painting wet into wet. And then I'm going back in while the clouds are still wet and I'm laying in all the shadow parts of the clouds. There's a lot of information here. There's soft little value changes. I want to paint all that really nice and loose and wet into wet in this phase of the painting. Let's look at what I'm using so far. Raw sienna and a touch of lavender. This part here where you're seeing it's more cool, that's more lavender. And the parts where it's a little bit warmer, that's more raw sienna. Okay, so this is what the sky looks like before I've dropped any blue into the sky. This is really soft, wet into wet, loose, abstract clouds. Now, I'm loading up a brush with some deep, rich blue pigment. That is Cobalt Blue and Cerulean. And now that I have this brush loaded up, I can go up here and I can paint the blue part of the sky. And so we're negatively painting around the clouds. That means we're using the blue around the clouds to define the shape of the cloud. And I want to point out this brush that I'm using. That is size 18 Scoda Perla. It's a pretty good size brush, but it's a synthetic brush that doesn't hold too much paint and too much water. When I'm painting a sky specifically, that's when I really like to use this brush. It holds more than a smaller synthetic brush, but it doesn't hold so much that it's going to just flood down my paper and disturb this wash. And you'll notice that even though I dampened all of my paper, so these little bits, this harder edge, I can do that because the paper has set long enough and it's still workable, but it's not too wet. When you see up here, the blue up here, I'm using a darker, richer mix of Cobalt Blue. When I get down near the horizon, I'm using more Cerulean Blue. And when you go outside and you look at a sky, you'll notice that it is a darker, richer blue up at the top. And as it comes down nearer to the horizon, it's more diffused. Okay, so we're done with the sky. Let's get into the rest of the light values of this scene. I know that that distant hill is going to be darker than the sky, but I want to drop in some of the light values right now while the paper is wet. So I'm using some raw sienna, a little bit of neutral tint, and some lavender for this. And then as I get closer, I'm introducing more green, so more Cobalt Turquoise and raw sienna. And now I'm getting down to, you'll see there's this hill behind the buildings. That hill is really catching the light. And that was one of the things I really liked about this late afternoon light. The sun was coming in and kind of catching this hill, and it was kind of glowing. And I want that warmth. I want that feeling of light right here in the middle ground behind those important buildings in my scene. So I'm increasing the saturation. I'm using more raw sienna, and in some of the greens I'm using some cadmium yellow. So we're going from a really dull olive pool green to a more vibrant green when we get into the middle ground. And I can't tell you how important that is to bring that part of the painting forward and let the other just kind of sit in the background. So organizing the painting with background, middle ground, foreground is very important. Here I wanted to lay in the light values of the barn, the roof of the barn. So I'm using a little bit of Cobalt Teal Blue and a little bit of Cerulean with a touch of raw sienna. It's okay to let those colors just flow into each other. See how nondescript and loose the form of this house is? All of that will make more sense when I wrap the middle values around the light values here. But it's okay in that first wash to let things be a little more abstract. It doesn't need to look like you're finished painting right away. And as I get down to the foreground, I'm introducing a little more warmth. And even though it's wet into wet, I wanted to have a little more variation. There's more detail as the scene gets closer to us. That's all the light values. We have our sky in place. We have the light around the scene. Now let's go see what it looks like when we get the middle values into the painting. Okay, here we go. Now what I'm doing before I start is I have some water on a clean brush and I dampened the distant mountain. I wanted a little bit of variety and some softness in the edges on some of that here. That creates a nice variety of edge, some soft, like cloud shadows landing on the hill back here. The reason we paint in layers is so we can create some beautiful light and complexity in our paintings. And what that allows us to do is we laid this in all in the first wash. Now in the second wash, we can paint over it and decide what areas to leave behind. That adds a lot of variety and some sophistication to your painting that you wouldn't have if you were just painting a hill just as a solid, flat, one color shape in the background. All right, so working my way down that hill, and the base of that hill is defining this hill that's in light. So I'm bringing that down to that area. And as I get down to here, I'm using thicker paint with a little more saturation with some raw sienna, Cobalt Turquoise, and I'm leaving a little bit of that because as we get closer, we want more texture in the scene. And down at the bottom where these trees are, they really break up that area, and I wanted to have a little bit more detail at the base of that hill. Now I'm finding ways to connect this shadow shape into the hill that I've already painted. And I started over here on the left, and I'm using Cobalt Turquoise with some neutral tint and raw sienna and a touch of raw umber. That's what I'm using here. And the shadow is great for negatively painting around trees and around these buildings. It's a big connector in the scene. All right, I'm working my way up, trying to not just take away everything, being mindful of what I'm leaving behind, the light on that hill. The value of the house, the shadow side of the house, goes right into this shadow on the hill. And see, again, similar to the first wash, I'm letting those colors just flow into each other. When I need more definition, I'll get it in the next phase, in the dark phase of the painting. And remember how nondescript and just blobby this house was? Well, it's starting to take shape as we paint the shadow around it. And I'm liking the shadow side of this shed. I'm going to use some gouache later on to really get the light back on the top of that. And I'm taking some green and connecting the shadow side of this tree into that. Doing the same thing over here with these trees that I've defined just by painting around them. I'm using some more saturated green and connecting it right into all of this. And that's helping the middle ground bringing a little more attention to the middle ground. And that saturation is drawing the eye there. Always finding ways to connect. This middle ground needed a little more texture. I'm taking what I put in there, dragging it down to show the terrain of the land and how it kind of swoops up a little bit there. And now connecting that in to a little more texture in the middle ground. Over here, I'm using some more raw sienna, Cobalt Turquoise, to make a stronger green color. There are some trees that are nice verticals. I'm adding that in now and dragging up to show those trees. That nice broken edge against the soft edge of the sky really works to create that feeling of distance. It brings that middle ground closer to us and lets that sky just be pushed back and feel further away, which is very important. That is the middle value shape of the scene. We started over here on this hill. I pre-wet some of it so I could get some softer transitions in color back there and some soft edges. And then as we come down, I left a little bit more of that first wash to indicate some texture. And then I started connecting the shadow into that. And I used the shadow to paint around these buildings to show the light on the hill and to connect into what's happening here in the middle ground. Then I went back with some stronger paint and got those broken edges against the sky. Now that that has dried, we're ready to move into the darks and the details. I'm starting here on the buildings and these barns. We've done all that hard work with the light and the middle values, all the drawing, everything to get to this point. Now the darks are really going to bring the scene together and let the light really stand out. I usually tend to start with my focal area first, getting it polished, getting the darks how I want them to be, and then I move around to the rest of the scene. Shadow side there, some bits of dark and shadow on some of the trees and plants, little fence posts and verticals here, and a few darks there to show the tree line And I put a few little fence posts in the foreground. I thought that was a nice little touch that I picked up on in the reference photo. And then I needed one more wash here to finish up that foreground. There are going to be little things that you can't avoid when you're painting, little things that you go over. Gouache is good for getting that little sparkle of light, those little bits of highlights around the scene that are just kind of impossible to paint around. And so little touches of things catching the light, it breaks up little dark areas. And one reason I really wanted to use it here was to fix the roof of that shed. It was kind of sloping down a little bit. I wasn't liking how it was looking, and so I added some gouache, and that actually ended up being one of my favorite parts of the painting, because your eye goes right here. That shed with the light colored roof and the dark shadow, the shadow behind it, just a lot of good things happening here with the values. And I would have missed out on that if I hadn't touched it up with a little bit of gouache. And here is a look at the finished painting. I was excited with how this one turned out. I hope that this look into my process can help you understand what to do in each phase of your paintings as you work through the scenes that you are excited to paint. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone, you could print it out, and you can take a look at these crucial planning steps before you start each painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.